The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber opened with a sound that echoed through the vast space like thunder rolling across empty skies, and Hyun-woo Kim walked inside with his head held high, even though he knew what was coming next would change everything for his people back on Earth. And beside him walked Sora Park, who had her hand resting on the ceremonial sword that all military representatives carried to these meetings. But today it felt heavier than usual because they both knew this was not going to be a normal diplomatic discussion, but rather something that would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another in human history. The chamber itself was a marvel of alien engineering with walls that seemed to stretch upward forever until they disappeared into a darkness that might have been the ceiling or might have been the void of space itself, and floating in organized rows were the seats of the council members, each one designed for a different species with different needs and different ways of existing in the universe, but all of them united in one thing today, which was their desire to deal with what they called the human problem once and for all. Chancellor Vexatar stood at the center. Podium. His tall frame covered in the traditional robes of his office, which were made from a material that seemed to shift colors depending on how the light hit it, and his forearms moved in graceful gestures as he spoke in the universal translator, language that allowed all the different species to understand each other, even though the actual sounds coming from his mouth were like nothing any human had ever heard before. Hyun-woo had been preparing for this moment for months, ever since the first rumors had reached Earth about what the Council was planning, and he had studied every piece of galactic law he could find and memorized every treaty that Earth had signed since first contact 20 years ago. But now, as he stood in this place surrounded by beings who saw his entire species as a threat, he realized that all his preparation might not be enough to change what was about to happen. The charges against humanity were read aloud by a clerk whose species Hyun-woo did not recognize, and the voice that came through the translator was cold and mechanical as it listed item after item of supposed human aggression and unpredictability and warmongering that had convinced the Council that Earth and all its people were too dangerous to remain part of galactic civilization. Sora listened to each accusation with growing anger because she knew the truth behind every single incident they mentioned and how the Council had twisted facts and ignored context to make humans look like monsters when in reality they had been defending themselves or protecting others or simply trying to survive in a universe that had not exactly welcomed them with open arms from the very beginning. The first charge was about the mining dispute on Kepler 7, where human workers had fought back against alien overseers who were treating them like slaves and working them to death in dangerous conditions, but the Council described it as unprovoked human violence against peaceful alien administrators who were just trying to maintain order. The second charge was about the rescue mission to save the Altarian refugees whose ships had been attacked by pirates and left drifting in space with no power and no life support. But the humans who saved them had to fight the pirates to do it, and somehow the Council saw this as evidence of human aggression rather than human compassion. The third charge was about the incident at the trade station, where human merchants had refused to pay the new taxes that the Council had imposed without any discussion or vote, and when Council enforcers tried to seize human ships by force, the humans had defended their property. But again, the Council twisted this into a story about human lawlessness and disrespect for authority. Each accusation hit Hyun-woo like a physical blow because he could see how the Council had carefully selected only the parts of each story that made humans look bad while ignoring everything that explained why humans had acted the way they did, and he realized that this was not really a trial at all, but rather a ceremony to justify a decision that had already been made. When the charges were finished, Chancellor Vexatar spoke again, and his words were like knives cutting through the air as he explained that the Galactic Council had voted and decided that humanity posed too great a risk to the peace and stability of galactic civilization, and therefore Earth and all human colonies would be placed under complete isolation until such time as humans could prove they had changed their aggressive nature. The isolation would be total and absolute, with no trade allowed between Earth and any galactic civilization, and no travel permitted in either direction, and all communication channels between Earth and the rest of the galaxy would be jammed and blocked, and most importantly, a quantum barrier would be constructed around the entire Sol system to make sure that humans could not leave and that no one else could enter. Hyun Woo stepped forward, and his voice was steady despite the rage and fear that was building inside him as he spoke about all the good things that humans had contributed to galactic society, including the medical advances that had saved millions of lives, and the engineering innovations that had made space travel safer for everyone, and the art and music and literature that had enriched the cultural heritage of dozens of worlds. But Chancellor Vextar dismissed all of this with a wave of one of his four hands, and said that whatever minor contributions humans might have made were insignificant compared to the threat they posed, and that the Council had a responsibility to protect the galaxy from species that could not control their violent impulses. Sora could not stay silent any longer, and she stepped forward with her hand still on her ceremonial sword, and her voice cut through the chamber like a blade as she delivered humanity's response to this judgment, and her words were simple and clear and carried a warning that none of the council members seemed to understand. She told them that humans had survived ice ages that had covered their world in frozen death for thousands of years, and they had survived plagues that had killed millions but had made the survivors stronger, and they had survived world wars that had nearly destroyed their entire civilization, but had taught them the true value of peace and cooperation. And if the Council thought that isolating Earth would break the human spirit, then they were about to learn just how wrong they could be. The chamber fell silent after Sora finished speaking, and for a moment it seemed like the Council members might reconsider their decision. But then Chancellor Vexatar smiled with an expression that looked more like a predator showing its teeth than any sign of humor, and he said that human defiance was exactly why this isolation was necessary, and that in a few decades, when Earth was struggling to survive without galactic support, they would be begging to rejoin civilization on the Council's terms. As the human delegation was escorted from the chamber by armed guards who made it clear that they were no longer welcome on the station, Yunwoo and Sora could hear the sounds of celebration beginning behind them as the council members congratulated themselves on solving what they saw as a major problem. But neither of the humans looked back because they both knew that this was not an ending, but rather the beginning of something that the Galactic Council would live to regret. 15 years had passed since the Galactic Council had sealed Earth away from the rest of the universe, and Dr. Ji-Hoon Lee stood in his laboratory looking at the quantum field generator that hummed with barely contained power and represented everything that humanity had become during those years of forced isolation, and beside him, Minji Choi was making final adjustments to the control systems that would allow them to test their latest breakthrough, which was nothing less than complete mastery over the same quantum technology that the Council had used to trap them. The barrier around the Sol system still glowed with its alien energy when viewed through the right instruments, and it stretched from the edge of Pluto's orbit all the way out to where the solar wind finally gave way to interstellar space. And for the first few years after it had been activated, Earth's scientists had simply studied it and tried to understand how it worked. But now they had done something that the Council had never imagined possible, and turned their prison into their greatest advantage. Ji-Hoon remembered the early days when food riots had broken out in major cities as trade routes were cut off and when power grids had failed, because they depended on alien technology that could no longer be maintained or replaced, and when despair had settled over the planet like a heavy blanket as people realized they were truly alone in a hostile universe. But instead of breaking under the pressure, humanity had done what it had always done best and adapted. The first breakthrough had come from an unexpected source when a group of children in Seoul had been playing with broken pieces of alien technology and had accidentally discovered that certain combinations of Earth materials could interact with quantum fields in ways that the original designers had never intended, and what started as a curious observation in a school science fair had eventually led to the development of humanity's first quantum manipulation devices. Minji had been one of those children, and now she was the chief engineer of Project Renaissance, which was humanity's secret program to not just survive isolation, but to thrive in it and emerge stronger than ever before. And as she worked on the delicate calibrations needed for today's test, she thought about how far they had all come from those dark early days when the future had seemed so uncertain. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter had been transformed into the largest shipyard that human hands had ever built, with massive construction platforms hidden inside hollowed-out asteroids and powered by fusion reactors that had been miniaturized to the size of automobiles and the ships. Being built there were unlike anything that had ever existed before, with hulls made from metamaterials that could phase in and out of normal space, and engines that created their own pocket universes to travel faster than light. Tae-hyun Song had been appointed director of the Solar Defense Initiative 3 years ago, and he spent most of his time traveling between the secret bases that had been established throughout the outer planets and the moon, and even in the depths of the Pacific Ocean, and everywhere he went, he saw evidence of humanity's incredible transformation from a dependent client species to something that was becoming truly formidable. The population of Earth had not decreased during the isolation as the Council had predicted, but had actually grown as people worked together in ways they never had before. And new cities had been built underground and underwater, and even in orbit around the planet, and the old divisions between nations had largely disappeared. As humanity united against the common threat of being forever cut off from the stars, Hae-jin Nam sat in her office at the newly constructed Diplomatic Corps headquarters and looked at the messages that were streaming in through quantum entanglement. Communicators that bypassed the Council's monitoring systems completely, and each message was from a different alien species somewhere in the galaxy, and they all told the same story of oppression and suffering under the Council's rule. The Melodians had once been known throughout the galaxy for their incredible artistic achievements and their ability to create beauty from even the most basic materials. But under Council rule, they had been forced into industrial work and forbidden from expressing their creativity, and many of them had sent messages begging for help from anyone who might be willing to stand against the Council's tyranny. The Valerians had been warrior poets who combined physical prowess with intellectual achievement, and who had developed a philosophy of honorable combat that emphasized protecting the weak and fighting for justice, but the Council had subjected them to genetic modification that had stripped away their aggressive instincts and left them docile and compliant and unable to resist even the most obvious injustices. There were dozens of other species, each with their own stories of how the Council had crushed their spirits and stolen their freedom, and Hae-jin had been working for years to establish contact with resistance movements on their worlds and to coordinate plans for what was beginning to look like an inevitable confrontation between the isolated humans and the galactic government that had cast them out. The quantum communicators were perhaps humanity's greatest achievement during the isolation years because they used principles that the Council's scientists had never discovered, and they allowed instantaneous communication across any distance without any possibility of interception or jamming, and through these devices, humanity had learned the truth about what the galaxy had become under Council rule. It was not the peaceful utopia that the Council claimed to have created, but rather a vast prison where creativity was discouraged and independence was forbidden, and where any species that showed signs of developing advanced technology or independent thinking was quickly brought under control through various forms of coercion and manipulation. The Council maintained its power through careful management of resources and technology, and by making sure that no single species had access to enough knowledge or materials to pose a threat to the established order, and they had convinced most of the galaxy that this was the natural way of things, and that any attempt to change it would lead to chaos and destruction. But the messages that Hae-jin received told a different story. and they spoke of a galaxy where billions of beings lived lives of quiet desperation, and where the spark of innovation and exploration that had once driven galactic civilization had been systematically extinguished in the name of stability and order. The irony was not lost on any of the humans who worked on these projects that the Council's attempt to isolate Earth had actually freed humanity from the very system of control that was keeping the rest of the galaxy in chains, and while other species were forbidden from developing certain technologies or exploring certain ideas, humans had been forced to innovate and experiment and push the boundaries of what was possible. The quantum barrier that was supposed to keep humans trapped had become a laboratory where they could test technologies that would have been illegal anywhere else in the galaxy, and the isolation that was supposed to weaken them had instead allowed them to develop their full potential without interference from alien authorities who might have stopped them, as Ji-hoon activated the quantum field generator and watched as space itself began to ripple and fold around the test chamber. He thought about the report that would be delivered to Earth's leadership within the hour, and how it would confirm what many people had already begun to suspect, which was that humanity was ready to rejoin the galaxy, but not as the supplicant species that the Council expected. The test was a complete success, and the implications were staggering because what they had just accomplished meant that the quantum barrier around Earth was no longer a prison, but had become a doorway that humans could open and close at will, and that the technology the Council thought was beyond human understanding had actually been improved upon and perfected by human ingenuity. Minji looked at the readings on her instruments and smiled, because she knew that everything was about to change, and that the Galactic Council was about to learn that isolating humanity had been the biggest mistake in the history of galactic civilization. Captain Dongwoo Park stood on the bridge of the Defiant and watched as his ship's revolutionary phase shift drive engaged for the first time outside of Earth's solar system, and the stars around them seemed to flicker and dance as the vessel slipped between dimensions and became invisible to every sensor system that the Galactic Council had ever developed. And this was the moment that humanity had been working toward for 15 years, since the day they had been cast out and told they were too dangerous to exist alongside civilized species. The Defiant was unlike any ship that had ever been built, with a hull composed of metamaterials that could exist in multiple quantum states simultaneously and engines that manipulated the fundamental structure of space-time itself, and weapons that could reach across dimensional barriers to strike targets that thought they were safely hidden, and most importantly, it was completely undetectable to any technology that the Council possessed because it operated on principles that their scientists had never discovered. Dongwoo had volunteered for this mission, knowing that it might be a one-way trip into the unknown, but also knowing that if it succeeded, it would mark the beginning of the end for the Council's reign of oppression. And as his ship approached the coordinates where intelligence suggested they might find members of the Resistance, he thought about all the people back on Earth who were counting on him to make contact with allies who could help them change the galaxy. The first stop was a mining colony in the Vega system, where reports indicated that Melodian workers were being forced to extract rare minerals under conditions that violated every standard of decency that humanity had ever developed, and as the Defiant materialized in normal space near the colony, Dongwoo could see the massive industrial complexes that scarred the surface of what had once been a beautiful world. The Melodians had been artists and dreamers before the Council had decided that their talents were better suited to manual labor, and now they worked in underground tunnels where their natural ability to perceive beauty in all things was considered a dangerous distraction from their assigned tasks, and where any attempt to create art or express creativity was punished with immediate imprisonment or worse. Dongwoo sent out a carefully coded message on frequencies that the Resistance was known to use, and Within hours, he received a response from someone who identified himself as Zekthara and who claimed to speak for a group of Melodians who had refused to accept their fate and were working to overthrow their overseers and reclaim their world. The meeting took place in an abandoned section of the mining complex, where the artificial gravity had failed years ago and where floating debris created a maze that provided cover from surveillance systems. And when Zekthara appeared, he was nothing like what Dongwu had expected, because despite years of hard labor and oppression, his eyes still held the spark of creativity that the council had tried so hard to extinguish. Zekthara told the human captain about life under council rule and how every aspect of Melodian society had been restructured to serve the needs of the galactic economy, and how children were taken from their families at an early age and taught to suppress their natural instincts, and how anyone who showed signs of independent thinking was subjected to mental conditioning that left them docile and compliant. But he also told Dongwu about the growing resistance movement and how Melodians throughout the galaxy were beginning to remember what they had lost, and were working in secret to preserve their culture and their art and their hope for a future where they could once again create beauty instead of being forced to destroy it in the name of industrial efficiency. The second contact was even more dangerous because it involved meeting with Vorndak, who was a Valerian freedom fighter operating in the heavily patrolled Centauri sector, and the Valerians had once been the galaxy's greatest warriors and philosophers, but the Council had subjected them to genetic modification that had removed their capacity for violence and independent thought. Vorndak was one of the few Valerians who had somehow escaped the genetic conditioning, and he led a small group of others who had retained their original nature and were fighting a guerrilla war against Council forces. But they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned, and their only hope was that someone from outside the system might be willing to help them when Dongwu met with Vorndak. In a hidden base inside an asteroid field, the Valerian warrior was impressed by the humans' technology. But more importantly, he was amazed by the fact that humans had managed to resist Council control and had actually grown stronger during their isolation. Vorndak explained that the Council's power was built on carefully maintained lies, and that they convinced each species that resistance was futile by claiming to have overwhelming military superiority, and by making sure that no species ever learned how weak the Council actually was or how much their control depended on fear rather than actual strength. The Valerians had believed these lies for generations and had submitted to genetic modification rather than face what they thought would be certain annihilation. But now Vorndak was beginning to suspect that the Council's supposed invincibility was nothing more than an elaborate bluff designed to keep the galaxy's population under control. Back on Earth intelligence officer Yun Seo Jang was working around the clock to decrypt Council communications that had been intercepted by humanity's new quantum listening posts, and what she was discovering was even more shocking than anyone had imagined, because the internal messages revealed that the Council was terrified of humanity and had been from the very beginning. The decision to isolate Earth had not been made because humans were too aggressive, but because they were too inspirational, and every species that had come into contact with humans had started asking questions about why they had to live under Council authority and why they could not govern themselves and why they were forbidden from developing certain technologies or exploring certain ideas. The Council's own records showed that human influence had led to uprising attempts on 17 different worlds, and that the Council's military forces had been stretched thin, trying to suppress all the rebellions that had been inspired by human examples of independence and creativity and self-determination. The most damaging revelation was that the Council had actually tried to have humanity exterminated rather than isolated, but had been prevented from doing so by the intervention of several member species who had threatened to withdraw from the Council if genocide was committed in their name, and the isolation barrier had been a compromise solution that was supposed to contain the human threat while avoiding the political consequences of outright murder. Yuncio realized that this information could be used to turn council member species against each other and to expose the hypocrisy of an organization that claimed to promote peace while secretly planning the destruction of entire civilizations. And she began preparing a comprehensive intelligence report that would be distributed to every resistance cell that humanity had managed to contact. The most disturbing discovery came when Dongwu's team intercepted Council military communications that revealed their border patrols near the Sol system had been disappearing for months, and that the Council leadership was beginning to suspect that the quantum barrier might not be as effective as they had believed. Chancellor Vextar himself had sent encrypted messages to his military commanders asking for explanations about why ships that approached Earth's barrier were simply vanishing without sending any distress signals or leaving any wreckage behind. And the military leaders had no answers because they had no idea that human technology had advanced to the point where it could reach through dimensional barriers to eliminate threats before they could even detect what was happening to them. The Council was slowly beginning to realize that they had made a catastrophic error in judgment, but they were trapped by their own propaganda because they had spent so many years telling the galaxy that humans were contained and harmless that they could not admit the truth without undermining their entire authority structure. As Dongwu prepared to return to Earth with his new allies and the intelligence they had gathered, he knew that the next phase of humanity's plan was about to begin, and that the Galactic Council was about to discover that isolating Earth had not eliminated the human threat, but had instead created something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Admiral Sung-Ho Kim stood on the command deck of the Liberation and watched as the human Liberation fleet emerged from phase space directly into the heart of the Kepler system, where thousands of enslaved workers were dying in the mines that fed the Council's war machine, and his fleet of 200 ships represented the culmination of 15 years of secret construction and technological advancement, and each vessel was equipped with weapons and defenses that would have been considered impossible by galactic standards just a few years earlier. The quantum barrier that had once imprisoned humanity now served as their secret weapon because they could phase in and out of normal space at will, while Council forces remained trapped in conventional reality and unable to predict where the next attack would come from, and this tactical advantage was about to be demonstrated on a scale that would shock the entire galaxy commander. Yunji Lim led the first wave of assault ships toward the Kepler mining colonies, and her targets were the orbital platforms where Council overseers maintained control over the enslaved population through a combination of advanced surveillance technology and brutal punishment systems. And as her ships materialized around the platforms, the defenders had no time to react before their weapons were disabled by quantum disruption fields. The liberation of Kepler 7 took less than 6 hours, and when it was over, 12,000 workers from 17 different species were free for the first time in their lives, and the sight of humans fighting alongside aliens against their oppressors sent shockwaves through the galactic communication networks as news of the attacks spread faster than the Council could suppress it. Yunji had expected the workers to be grateful, but she was not prepared for the overwhelming emotional response, as beings who had given up all hope suddenly realized that freedom was possible, and that someone was willing to fight for them, and the tears of joy and the desperate thanks that poured out from the freed slaves made her understand why humanity had been isolated in the first place. The Council had known that human ideals were contagious, and that exposure to concepts like individual liberty and self-determination would undermine the carefully constructed system of control that kept the galaxy pacified and productive, and the liberation of Kepler 7 proved that their fears had been completely justified. Within days of the first liberation, rebellions began breaking out on worlds throughout the galaxy as news of human intervention spread through underground networks that the Council had never known existed, and species that had been passive for generations suddenly remembered what it felt like to hope for something better than endless servitude. Hyojin Nam coordinated the information warfare campaign from her command center on Luna, and she used hijacked council communication networks to broadcast the truth about human isolation and council oppression to billions of beings who had never heard anything except official propaganda, and her message was simple and devastating in its honesty. She told the galaxy that humans had been isolated, not because they were dangerous to peace, but because they were dangerous to tyranny, and that the Council had feared human influence, not because it led to violence, but because it led to freedom, and that every species in the galaxy had the right to govern themselves and develop their own technology and explore their own destiny without interference from self-appointed authorities. The broadcast reached every major population center in Council space before the authorities could stop it, and the impact was immediate and catastrophic for the established order as species after species began questioning why they needed Council permission to live their own lives and why they had to accept limitations on their development that served no purpose except to maintain Council power chancellor. Vextar tried to contain the growing rebellion by sending his most powerful warships to crush the human fleet. But when the Council's mighty dreadnoughts arrived at the coordinates, where the humans had last been detected, they found nothing except empty space and floating debris from their own patrol ships that had somehow been destroyed without ever seeing their attackers. The Council military had been built to intimidate subject populations rather than fight actual wars, and their ships were designed more for show than for combat effectiveness, and when they finally encountered human vessels in direct battle, the results were devastating for Council forces as weapons that manipulated space-time itself tore through armor that had been considered impenetrable. Admiral Sung Ho had studied every engagement that Council forces had fought over the past century, and he knew that their tactics had not evolved because they had never faced serious opposition, and their commanders were used to winning through superior numbers and advanced technology rather than through strategic thinking or tactical innovation. The human fleet used their phase shift capability to appear behind enemy formations and strike at vulnerable points before disappearing again, and this approach completely disrupted Council battle doctrine, which depended on maintaining formation integrity and coordinated fire patterns, and within weeks, the Council Navy was in complete disarray as they struggled to adapt to an enemy that refused to fight according to established rules. The turning point came when 3 Council member species publicly withdrew their support for the isolation of Earth and declared their intention to negotiate directly with human representatives, and these defections triggered a cascade of similar announcements, as species throughout the galaxy began to realize that the Council's authority was not as absolute as they had been led to believe. The Altarians were the first to switch sides completely, and they brought with them detailed intelligence about Council military installations and supply lines that allowed human forces to strike at targets that had been considered untouchable, and their decision to join the rebellion was motivated by gratitude for the human rescue mission years earlier that the Council had tried to use as evidence of human aggression. The Denebians followed shortly afterward, and they provided the human fleet with advanced sensor technology that made it even easier to track Council movements and avoid their patrols, and their defection was particularly damaging to Council morale because they had been considered one of the most loyal member species. Chancellor Vexi Tar realized that his authority was collapsing, and in desperation, he attempted to open negotiations with the humans through intermediaries. But when his secret message reached Hyun-Woo Kim, who had been elected as Earth's Prime Minister, the response was swift and uncompromising. Hyun-Woo reminded the Chancellor that he had been given an opportunity for diplomacy 15 years earlier when he had chosen to imprison an entire species rather than address their legitimate grievances, and he made it clear that the time for negotiation had passed and that the Council would now face the consequences of their actions. The psychological impact of this rejection was enormous because it demonstrated to the entire galaxy that the humans were not interested in rejoining the existing power structure, but were determined to replace it with something better. And this realization caused even more Council allies to reconsider their positions. The final blow to Council authority came when their own military forces began refusing orders to attack human ships because they had seen too many of their comrades die in hopeless battles against an enemy that seemed to appear and disappear at will, and several entire fleets simply withdrew from combat zones and declared themselves neutral in the growing conflict. The mighty hegemony fleet that had once been the symbol of Council power became a liability as crew members from dozens of different species began communicating with human forces and learning about the true reasons for Earth's isolation, and many of them decided that they would rather fight for freedom than continue to serve masters who saw them as expendable tools. As the rebellion spread across the galaxy and Council control collapsed in system after system, Admiral Seung-ho began planning for the final assault on the Council's home base at Nexus Prime, where Chancellor Vexitar and his inner circle were making their last stand and where the future of galactic civilization would be decided once and for all. The Great Chamber that had once been the seat of Galactic Council power now served as the courtroom where Chancellor Vexitar and his inner circle faced judgment for crimes against sentience and Hyun-woo. Kim sat in the chair that had once been reserved for the Council's supreme authority, but now belonged to the elected leader of the Liberation Alliance that had replaced the old order, and the irony was not lost on anyone present that the very beings who had once condemned humanity were now standing trial in the same place where they had pronounced their verdict of isolation. 1 year had passed since what historians were already calling the Terran Awakening, and the galaxy had been transformed beyond recognition as species that had lived under oppression for centuries were finally free to develop their own cultures and technologies and explore their own destinies without interference from self-appointed authorities who claimed to know what was best for everyone. The trial of the former Council leadership was being broadcast throughout the galaxy, so that every being could see justice being done and understand that the old system of arbitrary rule and enforced submission was gone forever, and that the new alliance was built on principles of equality and self-determination that would protect the rights of all species regardless of their size or strength or technological development. Chancellor Vexitar stood in the defendant's dock wearing simple prison clothes. Instead of his elaborate robes of office, and his forearms were shackled because he had been classified as a flight risk after attempting to escape to a hidden base in the Outer Rim where Loyalist forces were still holding out against Liberation forces, and his expression showed a mixture of defiance and bewilderment, as if he still could not understand how his carefully constructed system of control had collapsed so completely. The charges against him were extensive and included genocide. Through forced sterilization programs that had been used to control population growth among species that the Council considered problematic, and slavery through the forced labor systems that had been disguised as economic cooperation agreements, and cultural destruction through the systematic suppression of art and literature and philosophy that might inspire independent thinking. But the most serious charge was conspiracy to commit xenocide, because the evidence that intelligence officer Yunseo Jang had uncovered showed that the Council had seriously considered destroying Earth entirely rather than simply isolating it, and had only been prevented from doing so by the intervention of member species who had threatened to withdraw their support if genocide was committed in their name. The testimony from witnesses who had suffered under Council rule was heartbreaking and powerful as being, after being told their stories of families torn apart by forced relocation programs, and artists who had been subjected to mental conditioning that destroyed their ability to create, and scientists who had been forbidden from pursuing research that might lead to dangerous innovations. Dr. Ji-hoon Lee and Min-ji Choi were working together on the most ambitious project in galactic history, as they led teams of scientists and engineers from dozens of different species in an effort to share human technology freely with anyone who wanted to learn and to break down the artificial barriers that the Council had used to maintain control through technological scarcity. The quantum manipulation techniques that humanity had developed during their isolation were being taught to Melodian artists who were using them to create sculptures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and to Valyrian warriors who were incorporating them into new forms of defensive technology that could protect entire worlds from invasion. The forced integration of former Council military forces into the new Alliance Defense Corps was proceeding more smoothly than anyone had expected, as soldiers and officers who had spent their careers enforcing oppression discovered that they preferred fighting for freedom, and many of them had become humanity's strongest supporters after learning the truth about why Earth had been isolated. Captain Sora Park, who had become a decorated hero and symbol of human resistance, was now responsible for training mixed species units where humans worked, alongside beings who had once been their enemies, and she found that former Council troops were eager to learn new tactics and technologies that made them more effective at protecting innocent civilians rather than intimidating them. The exploration. Vessel New Horizon represented everything that the new galaxy could become as it prepared to launch the first joint species expedition to the galactic core, where ancient mysteries waited to be discovered by beings who were finally free to pursue knowledge for its own sake rather than for the benefit of distant authorities who cared only about maintaining their own power. Captain Tae-hyun Song stood on the bridge of the New Horizon and watched human children playing with young aliens in the ship's gardens, and he thought about how natural it seemed for different species to work together when they were not being manipulated by leaders who profited from keeping them divided and suspicious of each other. The children who were growing up in this new galaxy would never know what it was like to live under the old system where creativity was discouraged and independence was forbidden and exploration was limited to whatever served the interests of the ruling class, and they would take for granted freedoms that their parents had fought and died to achieve. The monument that had been erected outside the former council chambers bore an inscription that captured the bitter irony of everything that had happened, and it read simply that the Galactic Council had thought they were pulling the trigger on humanity, but had instead pulled it on themselves, and visitors from throughout the galaxy came to read those words and remember the price of tyranny. The new constitution of the Liberation Alliance was based on principles that humans had developed during their isolation, including the radical idea that every sentient being had the right to make their own choices about how to live and what to believe and what to create, and the right to associate freely with others regardless of their species or origin or ideology. Trade between different worlds was flourishing as barriers that had artificially restricted commerce were removed and species that had been forbidden from developing certain technologies were finally able to pursue their own paths of advancement, and the result was an explosion of innovation and creativity that surpassed anything the galaxy had seen during the Council's reign. The former Council. Worlds were being integrated into the Alliance through a process of gradual democratization that respected local customs while ensuring that basic rights were protected, and many of these worlds were discovering that self-government was more effective than distant rule by authorities who knew nothing about local conditions and needs. Some species chose to remain isolated, and the Alliance respected their decision because the new system was based on voluntary cooperation rather than forced participation. And the contrast with the old Council's policy of mandatory membership was stark and served as a reminder of how much had changed. The resistance movements that had helped humanity during the Dark Years were being rewarded with positions of leadership in the new alliance, and beings like Zekthara and Vorndak found themselves representing their people in a government that actually listened to their concerns and respected their contributions. The quantum barrier around Earth had been dismantled shortly after the Council's defeat, but many humans had chosen to remain in the Sol system where they continued their research and development work. And Earth itself had become a symbol of resistance and hope for oppressed beings throughout the galaxy as Hyun-woo Kim reviewed the daily reports from Alliance worlds and saw evidence of growing prosperity and freedom everywhere he looked. He reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this point, and how the Council's attempt to destroy humanity had instead created the catalyst for the liberation of an entire galaxy. The future was full of possibilities that had been unimaginable during the years of Council rule, and the greatest irony of all was that the Galactic Council's greatest fear had come true as human ideals of freedom and self-determination spread throughout the galaxy and transformed it into something better than anyone had dared to hope was possible.